Could you explain the nature of the prior commitment?
No.
Los Alamos is...
Just a flat no. Today we're going to be looking at another one of BobbyBroccoli's videos. Specifically, the conspiracy to kill cold fusion. Conspiracy. Who are the conspirators? The laws of physics. This is the finale of the series on the men who promised unlimited energy. If you haven't seen part 1 yet, I'll pin it down below. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Tyler Fultz. I'm a nuclear engineer with a little over 10 years of experience in the commercial nuclear power industry, from engineering operations to emergency response. I don't claim to know everything there is nuclear, but I can certainly share some knowledge.
Nebula for sponsoring this video. On the 22nd of July, 2023, a preprint of a physics paper appeared online. It will be all anyone can talk about for the next month. It concerns a material called LK-99, a room temperature superconductor.
Okay, I heard about this one. The superconductor that wasn't.
Superconductors were first found in the early 1900s. They're remarkable because they have almost zero electrical resistance when brought down to frigid temperatures, often close to absolute zero. And then in 1986, something amazing happened. Physicists had stumbled onto materials with critical temperatures as high as 77 Kelvin, a temp we can reach with liquid nitrogen. It was a complete upending of the scientific status quo. In one of the fastest turnarounds in the field's history, the discoverers won the Nobel Prize the very next year.
So let's back up. So critical temperature is the point where you can't make a substance a liquid if you go above it, no matter how much pressure you apply. Say in a pressurized water reactor, for instance, the temperature of the water, its liquid water, is on the order of 600 degrees Fahrenheit. But it's very heavily pressurized, upwards of 2200 psi, so it's still liquid water. Above that temperature, liquids and gases kind of blend together in what's known as a supercritical fluid. This is not to be confused with taking a reactor supercritical, which means you're raising reactor power. But the significance of having a critical temperature so low, of 77 Kelvin, is, like you said, that's when liquid nitrogen boils. So if you go if the critical point is less than that, that presents some challenges. You're going to have to use something colder, like liquid helium, which is more of a pain to work with. It's less abundant, it's more costly to storage, and you go through it quicker. You go through it more quickly compared to liquid nitrogen, which nitrogen is everywhere. 70-something% of the atmosphere. And it's actually the threshold for above 77 Kelvin is considered high temperature superconductors. They can help out with things like power grid efficiency, minimizing your line losses, as well as anything that uses big magnets like MRI machines or particle accelerators, or even nuclear fusion reactors. Though I'm still talking about hot fusion rather than cold fusion.
Since then, the path forward has been obvious. Keep raising the temperature. Find one that can operate at room temperature. Without the limitation of cryogenic coolers, maglev trains could go further, MRI machines would be cheaper.
I mentioned maglev trains, that's another cool application.
And even our power grids might be 20% more efficient. Maybe one day we could end our dependence on oil and gas. It would fundamentally change the entire way we lived.
Just by more efficient transmission lines? I mean, your oil and gas will go further that you're using for power plants, but sure, he's talking about an optimistic goal to its logical extreme. That's fair.
And we've been searching for that holy grail for decades. That's why LK-99 took the world by storm. For a brief moment, people wanted to believe in something. LK-99 wasn't particularly exotic. A mixture of copper, lead, phosphorus, and oxygen with a hexagonal crystal shape. It looks like a hunk of unremarkable gray metal. Two of the paper's authors, Lee and Kim, said they'd been working on it since 1999, hence the name. This made for a great underdog story. If real, it would almost guarantee Korea
using that sort of mentality, like COVID-19. Okay.
Its first ever Nobel Prize, a goal the country had been chasing for decades. Because it was made of relatively cheap and easy to find materials, the barrier for entry was super low. It was so accessible, in fact, that everyone from huge national labs to hobbyists in their basements were cranking out experiments. Science is most often done out of the public eye, mostly because it's difficult, but also because it's generally very boring. But with LK-99, this was something different. Amateurs were documenting their progress on Twitter. Reddit threads
my.
tracked updates with meticulous detail.
The idea of having an experiment peer-reviewed by how many likes or upvotes on Twitter, that's hilarious.
LK-99 was a spectator sport because it felt like history was being made in real time. Part of what really captured people's imagination was the videos. The Korean team had shown a piece of LK-99 about the size of a coin levitating in a magnetic field.
Nice.
This was a showcase of the Meissner effect, one of the two main properties of a superconductor. Soon, several
Meissner effect is when a superconducting material gets below its superconducting temperature. It expels a magnetic field, a repulsive magnetic field, hence the levitation.
more videos of levitating scraps began to appear on Twitter, each one being viewed as further evidence of confirmation. On Bilibili, a Chinese social media app, one levitation video became the most viewed video of August 1st. The reaction from many was that there is clearly something here. It doesn't take fancy equipment to tell you what you can see with your own eyes. With the cryptocurrency market
I think I know where this is going. He's drawing the parallels between this and what was presented in the previous parts. I like that.
crashing in 2023, many speculative investors turned their attention to LK-99 as the next big thing. Korean and Chinese tech stocks surged for 2 weeks before returning to normal in early August.
I wonder what it must be like to be a speculative investor. I guess you just put a little bit into something in hopes for a massive return that probably isn't going to happen, but why not roll the dice sort of situation.
Scams, hype, and misinformation flourished. Fan fiction about the authors was being published on Twitter, but shared without people realizing it was completely fake. The language barrier made it even harder to verify fact from fiction. But many scientists from the beginning had been skeptical. This was not their first rodeo. They'd lived through Hendrik Schon, and Ranga Dias had a paper retracted just the year before. Everyone and their kitchen sink had claimed a room temperature superconductor before, and it was unclear why this one would be any different. First of all, the paper hadn't even been peer-reviewed. It was just a preprint. And second of all, levitation is not exclusive to superconductivity.
Biggest red flag right there is just no peer review. So if you're trying to figure out if something is a superconductor rather than a mediocre conductor, sorry, that was bad, you need to observe the elimination of electrical resistance below its critical temperature, the levitation, the Meissner effect type of levitation, the one that due to a magnetic field that gets expelled when you get below said critical temperature, and you just need to measure it. Measure temperature, measure current, measure magnetic field strength. Kind of like trying to measure the cold fusion device without having neutron detectors.
Plenty of magnetic materials levitate for a variety of less interesting reasons. And thirdly, no one had provided the data that actually mattered. The resistivity. Unless it reliably went to zero,
resistivity is the reciprocal of conductivity. So yes, that's another way you can look at the same thing.
there was plenty of room for error. The skepticism was met with pushback. Open minds are how paradigms are upended. Let's wait and see. But as the weeks wore on, the tide quickly began to change. At least 15 labs found they couldn't replicate the effect.
Sleuths.
A paper published in Nature on August 16th was considered by many the definitive final word. LK-99 isn't a superconductor. It is an insulator. Any effect that looked like superconductivity
So not even a mediocre conductor, the opposite of a conductor.
was inconsistent at best and due to impurities in the samples, which arise due to contamination in the fabrication process. These effects are not superconductivity, but rather small instances of regular magnetism. There was no
Boring
obvious
magnets.
evidence of fraud, no data that was knowingly manipulated. They just got it wrong.
Yeah.
None of this controversy needed to happen, and it can all be traced back to one key reason.
I mean, misinterpretation of results can happen. Just one of the reasons why I have it peer-reviewed, and there was probably a lot of hype. I mean, these guys were looking at it since 1999. They really wanted to believe it to be true.
Because the team went public before their paper was properly peer-reviewed. Both Kim and Lee said that the initial paper was posted online without their permission by another author. Lee called it incomplete, and Kim admitted it was full of flaws. As for why that author rushed to go public, the reasons are unclear, but some signs point to a fear of leaks. but it is clear that they thought they had something truly real. Even though much of the world stopped paying attention in August of 2023, some true diehards persisted. The original Korean group told anyone still listening that future papers would fix the issues. And throughout 2024, groups in Japan and China insist that they are on the verge of a breakthrough. At the time of writing, it's a little more than a year since LK-99 had its 15 minutes in the spotlight. There is something powerful about its promise that allows it to persist in people's minds. They put aside their usual skepticism because the potential payoff is so big. Like betting on the lottery.
Yeah.
You know the odds aren't great. Astronomical even. But if it ever paid off, it would change the world.
Reminds me of that one quote, I think it was from The Office, where Kevin said, if someone gives you 10,000 to 1 odds on something, you take it. Just put a couple of bucks down. Something of that effect.
So why not keep trying? What's a couple extra months? What's 1 year? What's 2? The longer you keep at it,
Sunk
the
cost
lonelier
fallacy.
it gets. Every day you keep going,
If you keep
your
putting more
peers
in
lose
it.
a little bit of respect for you. And you may even pass a point where your credibility is permanently stained. By then, why not go all the way? You just have to keep hoping that it will all be worth it.
Without some morals or something to believe in on this planet, be it God or science or whatever you truly believe in, what do you have? What do you have? What do you have? What reason do you have to survive? What reason do you have to go on?
He that doeth nothing is damned, and I don't want to be damned.
Huh. Limbo, okay.
For the majority
I don't know, that to me that still sounds like an application of the sunk cost fallacy.
of the world, Baltimore 1989 is where cold fusion died. It was so thoroughly eviscerated, alongside the credibility of Pons and Fleischmann, that anyone with just a passing interest gave up on the dream. It became just another entry in a long list of scientific inventions that turned out to be nonsense. Polywater,
oil.
N-rays, turning lead into gold, shorthand for the impossible.
Ether.
But ideas are nearly impossible to kill entirely. If it's tantalizing enough, there will always be champions for it. And so began the long, long summer. If you were in the room itself, cheering along 2,000 others to Nathan Lewis's talk, you might have been compelled to call cold fusion dead then and there. But those who weren't in Baltimore that day were not as easily swayed. Dozens of other labs had reported positive results. They were also seeing heat, neutrons, tritium, or some mix of the three.
Tritium.
Many were still on the fence, and the overwhelmingly negative atmosphere in Baltimore felt like a witch hunt to some. A level of skepticism that was crossing the line into prejudice. A refusal to even consider that there may be something new going on here.
People who have been unable to reproduce the experiment are not doing it correctly.
Lewis's talk had been recorded, but many scientists were not able to watch it for themselves.
So, even if we were to play devil's advocate and say they really were onto something, not being able to reproduce it easily with, the limited set of instructions they got, that doesn't exactly make it look like it's that good. So even if it wasn't complete hogwash, if it's going to be challenging, that still has the potential to shut something like this down.
And only heard of it secondhand from colleagues. Some argued that Lewis had done what he and so many others criticized Pons and Fleischmann of, going public before they had a peer-reviewed paper. But Lewis and his group were aware of this criticism, and so they did what Pons and Fleischmann did not. They opened themselves up to questions. Lewis was personally on the phone for hours each day, speaking to those who wanted answers. His group sent over their data and calculations via fax machine to anyone who wanted them. And in several cases, his team called up labs with positive results and pointed out errors in their experiments that eventually led to retractions. And this is why ultimately many groups came over to Lewis's side. Pons and Fleischmann had spent months refusing to divulge key information despite asking for millions of dollars in taxpayer money.
Transparency is a good way to win people over. After all, it shows you trust them. You can always take it too far, but still.
And on the rare occasions they did respond to questions, they often contradicted past answers. In Dallas, cold fusion's advocates were on top of the world. In Baltimore, its critics struck a near fatal blow. But you could argue that in both cases, those were echo chambers. The true decisive battle would require a confrontation of both sides, and that would take place
Chemistry
in Los
and
Angeles on May 8th. This was a special session of the Electrochemistry Society. This is the definition of home turf for Pons and Fleischmann. It's not just chemistry, it's electrochemistry, their exact subfield.
We visited the Colosseum where the Christians, were
These guys are experts in.
fed to the lions. I mean, the parallel has occurred to me.
They'll be surrounded by allies in a smaller arena of just 1,600. And the organizers had made a point of stacking the list of speakers with only those who reported positive results. However, as soon as news of this became public, the organizers received massive back.
The fact that there are like sides, allies, enemies, I mean, that immediately shows that there's funny business going on. And I know I'm not, because part of peer reviews in any sort of scientific work are to avoid your own preconceived biases and have them confirmed or rejected, and have your hypotheses confirmed or rejected just in the interest of science. So the fact that we're at this point, man, it's not looking good for them at all.
Backlash, and agreed to accept negative papers too. The conference itself took place without much friction, but it was the press conference that took place after that caused a PR nightmare. Hugo Rossi, Dean of Science at U of U, called LA, quote, the end of innocence. After enjoying an amicable relationship with the press for over a month, you can tell from the very first question that the vibes have shifted.
Dr. Fleischmann, I was one of the few reporters that paid the $200 to get in there, and I think on behalf of the press, we'd like to object that the session was not open to regular press coverage. Are you willing to acknowledge?
Ooh, that's so, yeah, paid to get in and not even getting to ask the questions they prepared. That's
any possibility at all that your observations are wrong and that you did not have fusion, or are you completely convinced you had fusion?
Look at the expressions on his face as he's hearing the question being asked of him.
I have always been ready to acknowledge the fact that our experiments may be faulty. If we turn out to be wrong, I'll be the first to admit it.
Fleischmann shows visible frustration here.
Yeah.
Pons and Fleischmann had done a major pivot since Baltimore. The lack of neutrons wasn't bad news, it was actually good news. Why? Of the three radiation branches, they were focusing on the wrong ones. They shouldn't actually be seeing neutrons or tritium. They should be seeing helium. Here's the...
Okay, seeing the one that happens less than 0.1% of the time. I mean, yeah, it's large enough scale, you're going to see all of it, provided you have the right devices to see them, that is to say, the right radiation detectors.
Big issue, though. The third branch does not occur nearly as often as the first or second.
Yeah.
Whereas those two occur roughly 50-50, the third branch is just a fraction of a percent.
I thought he was going to say they're lucky that they didn't say neutrons, because if they did, well, the guy in the room would have had a very high neutron dose, hence the title of the previous episode, The Dead Grad Student Problem.
You could make the argument that something about doing it at room temperature might change these percentages, but there was no solid evidence to back this up.
I mean, it shouldn't any more so than the bare physics of room temperature creating this deuterium fusion reaction would prevent them from seeing it from the get-go. So, no, neutrons have been detected. I remember just basic measurements of neutrons from neutron sources at normal room temperature in college, not to mention measures of neutron dose at an operating nuclear power plant at 600 plus degrees Fahrenheit at 2200 plus PSI. And the readings do change when you're shut down and you cool down, but that's because as you're doing it, you haven't recalibrated your detectors for the temperature change yet. So the point being, when you measure background radiation first, like you should be doing when you're doing any experiment involving radiation before you bring your sources in there, that should at least baseline your detectors enough, rendering that a non-issue.
In fact, muon catalyzed fusion, which can and does often occur at room temperature, shows no significant change in its branching ratio.
Talked more about that in the previous episode.
And there's another thing.
Yeah.
This branch should give off gamma rays at 23.8 MeV. And since they weren't seeing those gamma rays, they argued that those rays were being absorbed by the palladium lattice.
23.8 MeVs is a lot. It's kind of like, the other question is, how much palladium are you going to have to stick in there to slow down 23.8 MeVs? More than they have.
A convenient explanation. But again, even this would have some visible evidence. High-energy electrons whizzing through water causes Cherenkov radiation, which has a distinct blue glow, which should be visible to the naked eye. When asked if they had seen this,
oh, it very much is. That's the cool blue glowy thing you see when a nuclear power plant is shut down. And that's the result of those particles traveling faster than light in water. You can't travel faster than light in a vacuum, but you can travel faster than light when the light has been slowed down, which is cool.
Pons said, quote, "To tell you the truth, we haven't even looked for it. We've turned the lights off in the laboratory and haven't seen anything, but it's not that dark." Helium tends to stay embedded within palladium, and so two labs present at the conference, MIT and Sandia, called Pons' bluff.
What are they going to suggest next? Chop the palladium in half and see if it glows?
They said they'd be happy to analyze the palladium to see how much helium was present. Pons says they can't do that for nebulous legal reasons.
That decision is not up to us. We have a prior commitment, and the decision is not up
Proprietary
to us.
palladium.
We will get fast results. We will get these analyses done forthwith.
Could you explain the nature of the prior commitment?
No.
Los Alamos
Just a flat no. I like that.
is in talks with U of U to make a collaboration happen. That deal, like many more to come, would soon fall apart. Pons' ever-growing paranoia and Utah's fear of handing the reins over to the federal government meant that negotiations would soon break down.
Alamos Laboratory has broken off negotiations with the University of Utah to collaborate on the Pons-Fleischmann experiments. The lab director says Los Alamos is tired of waiting for the U and will continue collaborating with BYU and Texas A&M.
Later on, a reporter, Tom Heppenheimer, angrily asks them why they haven't been able to run tests looking for helium.
Where is it?
Where is it?
We have not run that analysis yet.
Why not?
It is being run now.
We heard that people promised 3-day turnaround. I can get this on my...
I did not. I found out about that about an hour ago. Okay. I've not waited for laboratories to...
Essential issue.
What?
You just dodged the most essential issue.
To make matters worse for our duo, the list of speakers got a last-minute addition. Nathan Lewis had called in a favor and was going to commandeer the podium to ensure the negative side was properly represented.
We have no evidence for helium. We have seen no neutrons at levels 10 to the 7th times more sensitive than are reported by the University of Utah results. We have seen no evidence of gamma rays. We have seen no tritium in excess of the tritium that would be obtained by the natural enrichment of tritium in water. In conclusion, we have no evidence in our laboratory with any of our samples for fusion.
Natural enrichment of tritium. Yeah, by using some same roundabout logic, tritium waste in a nuclear power plant, you could argue we made fusion from fission. That sounds cool.
It is very difficult to believe that there are 3 sets of magic samples in the world.
One of the more memorable criticisms Lewis made was the lack of stirring in the cell, which may lead to hot and cold spots. Pons and Fleischmann tried to rebut this with a video presentation. They showed one of their cells.
I mean, come on. If you're making a fusion reactor, one key thing about any reactor design is you want it to be evenly distributed. That shows up in fission reactors. You want the heat distribution to be uniform. If it wasn't stirred or mixed, even if they did make it a fusion cell, I don't think it would be a very good fusion cell. It might have the equivalent of putting low octane fuel in your car. It'll have your car's fusion reactor knock all the time. I don't know.
bubbling and then added a red dye to it. They argued that if the dye mixed in uniformly, then by extension, so would the temperature. Lewis disagreed.
Yes, the magic uniform temperature tracking dye.
And argued they could not know this for sure unless they had actually measured this with multiple thermometers. When they're asked some critical questions about their gamma ray data, Fleischmann, through a bit of wishy-washy language, retracts the data. Their most convincing piece of evidence was now gone, and a key reason many scientists lost respect for the duo. And for what felt like the millionth time, they were asked if they had run a control with light water. Fleischmann jumps in to say they never have. Chuck Martin, who is sitting in the audience,
Hydrogen fusion. Awesome.
Is stunned by this, as he had spoken to Pons over the phone one day and heard the exact opposite. But one moment, more than any other, will be shared on the news all across the country. While Nathan Lewis is complaining about the lack of public data, Fleischman loses his cool, and they have a tense exchange which requires a moderator to intervene.
I'm very sorry that Professor Lewis has no information on the tritium levels. That is available, and is available in the correction list to the paper.
We know the foreground, we don't know the background. I would like to
The
specifically...
background, I beg your pardon, the background is available in the corrections to the paper.
That might be. I would like to specifically
Well,
hear
then
whether or not
please
helium...
Don't.
Could we go
laugh.
on? Could we
This
go
is
on with the
other
questions, please?
Certainly.
Yeah.
Fleischman claims here that the info Lewis wants is in the errata. Lewis backs down in the clip, and Fleischman appears to get a win here. But when Lewis later checks the errata published in April, the data is nowhere to be found.
Yeah, we changed our numbers without giving an explanation as to why is part of an errata.
Had been referring to a second errata, which wouldn't be public until June. While this is going on, Pons stares into the crowd with an expression that says he'd rather be anywhere else.
You wish now, looking back on what you've been through this last month or so, that you had just published this quietly instead of holding a news conference and kicked off this whole...
I don't think the result would have been any difference when the paper came out.
I think it would have been a very marginal difference.
Yeah.
But I wished we had been left to get on with our work at our own pace, without the media attention.
Wow, coming from the guys that called a press conference before having their stuff peer reviewed.
This would be their last press conference in public for almost an entire year. There had been 6 major meetings in just 2 months dedicated to cold fusion, unprecedented for any scientific phenomena. There will continue to be meetings hosted all over, but attendance continues to drop. The next one in Santa Fe, they plan for 1,500 attendees, but only 500 show up. And although they have their fair share of interesting details, they can be summed up with the comments of Edward Teller, father of the hydrogen bomb, perhaps the most accomplished fusion expert in the world.
Yeah, he did a lot of fusion in the form of weaponizing it not long after fission was weaponized, in the grand scheme of things anyway.
Though he wanted to believe in cold fusion, he suggested that they needed an entirely new particle to explain what they were seeing, the Meshuggah-tron, a play on the Yiddish word for crazy.
Okay, I was going to say, that one's a new one to me. That's awesome.
It's here where we'll fast forward.
Love the background music.
If you wanted, you could tell the story of cold fusion week by week, all the way till the end of 1989. I'll leave that for the books. Instead, I'll cover the highlights. In April, the Secretary of Energy, James Watkins, had ordered all 12 of the US national labs to work on cold fusion, and he had asked for weekly progress reports. In the meantime, he had also ordered the creation of a dedicated panel to investigate the issue. This panel was led by John Huizenga, an alumnus of the Manhattan Project. He assembled a group of 22 members, including Richard Garwin of IBM, Steve Koonin of Caltech, and Darlene Hoffman of Berkeley. Their job was to review the data of all labs reporting positive results, and in several cases, they had members visit in person. To avoid accusations
They're going to review the data, but they're not going to get data from Fleischman and Pons
of bias, the panel consisted of a mixture of nuclear fusion physicists, electrochemists, and everything in between.
Nice.
Accusations of bias would be made regardless, many of them by Stanley Pons.
Fusion scientist Stanley Pons previously put his lab off limits to the committee, saying they are biased against the experiments. But last-minute changes in that committee cleared the way for this visit.
Despite telling him beforehand that they wanted to see a full calibration dataset for a working cell, when they arrived, Pons said he didn't have that, and that none of the cells were currently producing excess heat because they had just had a power failure. Notably,
oh, wow. Obvious excuse is obvious, man.
When the panel visited other labs, like that of Texas A&M and Stanford, not a single visit happened to occur when a cell was actively producing heat. But on the other hand, there was an ever-growing
Yeah, it's one of those uncertainty principle things, right? The act of observing it changes the result, and too many people are observing it. It's one of those clap your hands if you believe kind of devices.
List of labs that had negative results. MIT, Caltech, Bell Labs, Brookhaven, Yale, Los Alamos, Princeton, University of Michigan, Sandia, Argonne, Max Planck Institute,
the red dots.
University of Tokyo, Chalk River. For Fleischmann, the most demoralizing one on a personal level had to be Harwell.
Britain's Harwell Laboratory announced it is giving up its attempts to duplicate the fusion experiments.
He had personally sent them fusion cells a month before the announcement, banking on their neutron detectors to see something he hadn't. But they declared in June they were stopping all cold fusion experiments.
Probably because they didn't see anything on their neutron detectors.
Harwell's reputation is such that it basically killed cold fusion entirely in the UK. And by now, many of the labs that had initially come out in favor had one by one retracted the results for one reason or another. It's worth exploring some of those reasons. On April 10th, two groups had raced to become the first in the country to confirm cold fusion. They were Georgia Tech, led by James Mahaffey, and Texas A&M.
Hey, my alma mater, Georgia Tech. Let's see how bad this makes them look.
Led by Chuck Martin. Georgia Tech later announced an error just 4 days later.
Okay.
Fusion researchers at Georgia
They reported the error. Good.
Tech have apparently run into a snag.
They realized with horror that the neutron detector was highly sensitive to temperature. So much so that even holding it in their hands doubled the neutron reading.
Squeeze it really hard. I'm making fusion. Awesome.
This is the sort of everyday equipment issue that would have been identified long before ever going public. But because this was cold fusion, and everyone was in a race to get second,
Yeah, the overhype, because that's a pretty obvious one. Just like I mentioned earlier, you check the background and you check the sensitivity.
Basic mistakes were made due to urgency. It was such a miserable experience that Mahaffey described their attraction as, quote, like going to a hanging where I was the hangee. The oversensitivity of neutron detectors was a widespread problem at several labs. At the minuscule scales they were observing, you could see a neutron spike from nearly anything. A radiation source one room over, a sodium lamp, or a sudden power draw in the electrical grid. Nuclear science labs, more than most places, would be filled with contaminants left over from past experiments. And even suppliers of palladium are found to have traces of tritium in their stocks before they ever get to a lab. Chuck Martin's group found they were seeing excess heat in light water as well as heavy water. They even swapped out palladium for carbon electrodes, and they still saw it. After
carbon fusion. That only happens in stars. That's pretty cool.
much digging, they realized that their thermometer had not been properly grounded. It was supplying extra electrical current, heating the water slightly.
I mean, ionizations, heat, just like with a Geiger counter, if you crank up the voltage too much, then you're going to get so many high counts just from the voltage causing ionizations, and then your detector's going to break.
Action comes 2 weeks after their initial press conference. Chuck Martin, who was a close friend of Pond's, spent weeks in a state of personal agony over the issue, but eventually decided to retract the paper. Pons viewed this as a personal betrayal. Two grad students in Seattle made waves on April 13th when they became the first groups to claim evidence of tritium production. They were using a mass spectrometer to count gas molecules. H2 has a mass of 2. D2 has a mass of 4. DT has a mass of 5. And TT has a mass of 6. If they saw masses of 5 and 6, it would imply tritium production. However,
or something else with a mass of 5 and 6.
This is still an ambiguous test, as it relied on the assumption that DDH and D3 were not being produced, which also have masses of 5 and 6 respectively. When they reran the experiment, they confirmed that they were seeing plenty of DDH, but no DT. They retracted the results on May 25th. Lewis's group at Caltech worked for weeks trying to come up with every possible explanation for a false positive.
It's almost this dark side of optimism, of wanting to see something so cool that could revolutionize human civilization. But it's just why you have to stay in process. Keep doing all of your lab procedures so you don't get erroneous results.
When they found one, they would go around phoning labs and warn them of these pitfalls. One way to detect tritium is to mix a special chemical cocktail. Tritium, being radioactive, will cause the cocktail to emit small flashes of light. However, they soon discovered that the lithium electrolyte in the water bath has small traces of potassium in it, which also causes the small flashes.
Both tritium and potassium are beta emitters, so it's the same type of radiation. So it's a bit like saying because something is a beta emitter, it's automatically tritium, which isn't the case.
They also found an explanation for why some labs were seeing small amounts of helium embedded in their palladium rods. Helium is often used as a cooling agent in general lab work. Over time, glassware will slowly absorb helium. Throughout the cold fusion experiments, small amounts of helium were leaching into the palladium. In fact, this was the same reason that Paneth and Peters retracted their fusion paper.
All of this stuff is just sloppy. Contaminants, cleaning, not calibrating their instruments. Man.
All the way back in the 1920s. History had just repeated itself. Robert Huggins' group at Stanford claimed that they saw excess heat in both light and heavy water, with heavy water showing noticeably more. What his group didn't account for is that heavy water and light water have different electrical conductivity when lithium is added. With everything else the same, the heavy water will get hotter. But besides this, there also seemed to be a pattern with when they saw excess heat. It happened most often on the weekends. This is because less electricity is used on the grid on weekends, meaning slightly higher voltages were being supplied to the experiment. One thing that both critics and advocates of cold fusion agree on is that excess heat is inconsistent. You'd only see it very occasionally. As one member of the government panel, Al Bard, argued, what was happening is that all the results are points on a bell curve distribution. Some will show excess heat, most will show nothing, and some will even show negative. But that's how statistics work in an experimental setting.
And there have been enough experiments, so it probably would follow a bell curve normal distribution.
The average result is what you want to focus on. Therefore, it's misleading to publish a paper with positive results while neglecting to mention you saw far more negative results. If you actually took the negative results into account, your graphs would have massive error bars, showing that the excess heat was well within the margin of error. The government panel worked well into the fall. By their estimation, around $30 million had been...
You could easily take this the other direction instead of saying we're making fusion and doing excess heat. It's like, hey, we found a new way to cool stuff off, even colder water or something, I don't know.
...spent by US labs attempting to replicate the effect, and another $10 million abroad. When they published their final report in November, they concluded that there was not, quote, convincing evidence that useful sources of energy will result from the phenomena attributed to cold fusion.
The prospect of federal funding for cold fusion research virtually vanished today. The advisory group's recommendations are not binding on the Energy Department, but it would be unusual if they were ignored.
Maybe that's also why it's called cold fusion. It's because sometimes heat is actually removed in this case.
Although the panel largely came to a consensus, there was one bit of internal drama. One of the two co-chairs, Norman Ramsey, had been largely absent from the panel for most of its tenure. When he took the role on, he made a note to say it seemed, quote, a terrible job. And according to John Huizenga, his co-chair, Ramsey spent most of the summer abroad, and later in the year he won a Nobel Prize and was even less available. When they were drafting the final report, he blindsided them by announcing that he was going to resign. Having such a high-profile member resign right before they published would severely undermine the credibility of the report.
That doesn't look good.
Ramsey was willing to stay on if they included a preamble he wrote, which was much less negative about cold fusion than the rest of the report. The panel, feeling that they had been backed into a corner, accepted the lesser evil of including the wishy-washy introduction. Still, Ramsey's ultimatum would fuel rumors of conspiracy and a cover-up. Chase Peterson alleged that the panel was biased. Quote, the university's loudest critics have come from large...
All this stuff just seems so obvious, but I guess they're just so... I don't know.
...well-financed schools that have sizable stakes in the more conventional and more expensive hot fusion projects. On the other hand, more than a few hot fusion experts said the opposite.
In terms of the hard work I've put in for 10 years on this project, you know, it's sort of like kicking the teeth. But...
It actually said hot fusion physicist, not just fusion physicist. The fact that cold fusion hype got so prevalent that they're calling something that isn't cold fusion hot fusion. Man, throughout my career, I've never heard anyone say hot fusion, unless they're just making a contrast.
I certainly hope that they have something there.
If this development says that all the work that you've done in the past is really not relevant now because we have this new energy source, safe, cheap, and environmentally benign. I'd just be tickled pink if we had that.
The federal government would not fund cold fusion, although they were, quote, sympathetic towards modest support for carefully focused and cooperative experiments within the present funding system.
It's a funny way to say I'm sorry, but no more money. I'm going to go ahead and call it a part now. Please stay tuned for part 2 of this conspiracy against cold fusion. Thanks so much for the recommendation, and thanks so much for watching. I'll see you next time.